Welcome to the debate. Today we are focusing on, well, one of the most intellectually challenging aspects of American constitutional history, the amendments that sort of defy easy categorization. We have the foundational pillars, the Bill of Rights, right? Those first 10 defining civil liberties, and of course the indispensable Reconstruction Amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th, which fundamentally redefined citizenship and equality after the Civil War.
Indeed, But once you pull those two clear groupings out, you are left with a fascinating and frankly messy collection of 14 other amendments. This starts with the 11th, includes the 12th, and then continues from the 16th all the way through the 27th. We're talking about constitutional changes spanning 2 full centuries, ratified between 1795 and 1992.
And that is precisely the core of our question today. When you look at these remaining 14 amendments, these middle amendments, let's call them, do they constitute a cohesive, necessary body of structural reform? Are they part of an ongoing project aimed at, perfecting the mechanics and governance of the Republic? Or are they overwhelmingly a disparate collection of isolated and often highly reactive fixes responding only to specific historical crises or immediate policy deficiencies? Now, I'll be arguing that this body of work, when viewed with enough perspective, actually represents a continuous, coherent structural project.
And I take a different angle. While I'd agree every one of those 14 amendments was individually necessary at the time it was passed, I contend that as a collection, they simply lack thematic coherence. They are too varied in scope, too reactive to temporary policy fads, and too episodic in their timing to be considered a unified structural body, like the Bill of Rights is. They look, well, more like a necessary constitutional junk drawer than a carefully curated blueprint.
Well, my perspective is rooted in thinking about the Constitution as a high-functioning mechanism, a system that inevitably develops friction points and requires periodic, systemic calibration. The amendments ratified after Reconstruction represent, I think, an essential, ongoing process of refining the actual structure and mechanical functions of the Republic, addressing systemic flaws identified over decades of practical use. We really must look specifically at the machinery of government, not just the policy outcomes. If we look at the cluster of amendments dedicated solely to improving democratic structure and presidential succession, the pattern becomes, well, pretty undeniable. Think of the 12th Amendment, which fixed the chaotic process for the election of the president and vice president after the Jefferson-Burr debacle. Then you have the 17th Amendment mandating the popular election of senators. That's a profound structural shift away from the original conception of the Senate. And finally, the 22nd Amendment instituting the 2-term limit and the 25th Amendment detailing presidential disability and succession. These are not mere policy tweaks. They are fundamental structural updates that directly refine Articles 1 and 2 of the Constitution itself. That, to me, is cohesion.
Okay. That's a compelling argument, sure. But focusing solely on those success stories risks glossing over the immense divergence in subject matter and the historical context that drove them. While you highlight the electoral process, I argue that the collection as a whole is too fragmented to share the singular unifying theme you claim. Many of these amendments were highly specific responses to temporary political problems, not part of some grand, integrated design. Let's look at the evidence that sort of breaks your narrative. We have amendments driven purely by policy crises. The 16th Amendment, authorizing the income tax, was a clear response to financial needs and specific Supreme Court rulings that had thrown federal taxing power into question. This was about revenue, right? Not refining the core duties of the legislative branch. And the most glaring evidence of disparity? The 18th Amendment, prohibition, and its direct counter, the 21st Amendment, the repeal. These are the epitome of policy-driven anomalies, a huge national social experiment enshrined in the Constitution and then barely a decade later removed. That process might show flexibility, yeah, but calling a failed social experiment a fundamental structural component in the same category as, say, the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause, That stretches the definition of structural perfection to its breaking point. I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why. How can we consider prohibition and its repeal, the 18th and 21st Amendments, foundational components of structural perfection? You are focusing on the amendments that fix the processes of running the government, but these are changes about controlling social behavior. They address highly specific social policies. Are we supposed to believe that defining how much federal revenue can be collected through the 16th Amendment is structurally equivalent to fixing presidential succession via the 25th? The policy aims simply dilute any claim of unified structural progression.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. That's a fair critique of the policy side, but I would argue that even the 18th and 21st Amendments provide unique insight into the structural success of the American system, albeit in a, let's say, non-traditional way. While I concede they were policy-specific, and arguably poor policy at that, their very existence and subsequent repeal demonstrate the system's profound capacity for self-correction under intense public pressure, utilizing the highest legal mechanism available, the formal amending process. It wasn't just flexibility, it was resilience. The founders gave us a framework that could withstand the political turmoil required to pass a massive societal change like prohibition, and then, crucially, reverse it completely when consensus shifted. The fact that the structure held during this experiment is, in itself, structural proof. And regarding the 16th Amendment, the authorization of the income tax is fundamentally structural. It redefined the very taxing power of the federal government, altering the financial relationship between the citizen and the state that Article 1 originally established. That is not just policy. That is a foundational definition of federal power.
But viewing the 18th and 21st primarily as evidence of structural resilience means you're defining the entire collection by the elasticity of the process, rather than the intrinsic coherence of the content. A strong house can hold diverse furniture, sure, but that doesn't make the furniture a unified set. My core objection remains the immense variance in scope. The 16th was, arguably, an emergency response to judicial limits on federal power, not a structural enhancement driven by internal necessity. It was a reaction to a crisis, just like many others in this list.
Okay, let's shift back to the governing machinery, because that is where my strongest arguments lie, and I know you want to challenge the coherence there too. I highlighted the critical importance of the 17th Amendment, which took the power to elect senators away from state legislatures and gave it to the popular vote. And I noted this profoundly altered the federal balance originally conceived. But why did it happen?
Well, exactly. It happened because the original structural mechanism was failing, wasn't it? State legislatures were routinely deadlocked, leading to Senate vacancies that sometimes lasted years. States were effectively unrepresented in Congress because the original articles couldn't handle the political realities of the late 19th and early 20th century. The 17th Amendment was a necessary corrective, a patch designed to fix a problem that manifested over time, not part of some coherent, forward-looking blueprint for perfection.
I come at it from a different way, or rather, I see those specific reforms differently. These are not merely patches. They are crucial modernizations addressing structural weaknesses that the framers, operating back in the 18th century, simply couldn't have anticipated. Take the 22nd Amendment, instituting the two-term limit. You can argue it was a reactive fix driven by the experience of Franklin Roosevelt's 4 terms, which created genuine fears of executive overreach. Okay, but structurally, it was essential. It codified an informal custom established by George Washington into a mandatory legal restraint on presidential power, forever defining the scope and limit of the chief executive's time in office, a classic, necessary piece of constitutional reengineering. And the 25th Amendment, that came out of the necessity following Kennedy's assassination and the lack of clarity when Eisenhower was frequently ill. Before the 25th, if a president was incapacitated but alive, the government basically, it ground to a halt. The 25th created a clear, formal mechanism for temporary transfer of power. How can setting up the formal process of running the executive branch not be structural perfection? It ensures the government can actually function during a crisis.
I agree on the necessity of the 25th. It is a clear procedural improvement. But its creation under the shadow of crisis first. Eisenhower's health issues, then Kennedy's death, reinforces my point that the majority of these 14 amendments were reactive adaptations to unforeseen events, not proactive components of a master design. They are solutions to immediate problems, which is, well, the very definition of piecemeal change. Look further back to the 11th Amendment, one of the earliest in this non-categorized group. It was ratified because the Supreme Court, in Chisholm v. Georgia, interpreted Article 3 jurisdiction to allow citizens to sue states across state lines, which terrified state governments. The 11th was instantly passed to shut that down, guaranteeing state sovereign immunity. That is a hyper-specific procedural fix to a single judicial interpretation, not part of a broad movement toward perfected governance.
It highlights the collection's problem-solving nature rather than a unified effort.
But if we accept the premise that constitutional perfection includes the perfection of the citizenry's ability to participate in governance, then the entire narrative of cohesion holds together perfectly. You argue that the 19th Amendment, granting women the right to vote, and the 26th Amendment, lowering the voting age to 18, are disparate political victories separated by decades.
And they are fundamentally disparate. The timing and purpose reflect dramatically different historical forces. The centuries-long women's suffrage movement, culminating in the 1920s, versus the immediate political reaction 40 years later to the Vietnam War, where 18-year-olds were being drafted but couldn't vote. It's hard to claim a unified structural agenda that spans the entire period from the 12th Amendment in 1804 to the 27th in 1992 purely based on these two episodic victories.
I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning because it ignores, I think, the clear structural thread that ties all the rights expansion amendments together. The very existence of the 19th and the 26th, alongside the 15th Amendment that preceded them, demonstrates a continuous, overarching structural goal: the expansion and securing of the voting franchise, slowly removing barriers based on race, sex, and age. This goal is arguably the most cohesive philosophical narrative in the entire history of the Constitution's amendments. When we view the amendments that fix the processes of government, like the 12th, 17th, 22nd, and 25th, alongside the amendments that perfect the scope of the electorate, the 19th and 26th, a pattern of structural enhancement that focuses on making the government both functional and fair is, I think, undeniable.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on the timing. Even where the goals align, like expanding the franchise, the execution is reactive and episodic, dictated entirely by political opportunity and crisis, not by a single, integrated plan of structural improvement. The 27th Amendment, concerning congressional compensation, is a perfect, isolated example of this episodic nature. It was proposed way back in 1789 as part of the original Bill of Rights, but wasn't ratified until 1992, 2 centuries later, because some students realized it was still technically pending ratification. It's an anomaly of timing and procedure that simply cannot be bundled into a tidy narrative of sustained structural perfection.
Ultimately, my thesis remains that these amendments from 11 to 27, when viewed broadly, reveal a consistent pattern of enhancing democratic mechanisms and perfecting structural clarity regarding governance and voting rights. They are overwhelmingly dedicated to making the system work more efficiently or fairly, addressing fundamental elements of the original articles.
And I conclude that the presence of highly unique policy-focused experiments, like prohibition and its repeal, and the inclusion of isolated technical fixes, like the 11th Amendment correcting a Supreme Court error, or the 27th addressing compensation, scattered among the genuine procedural updates, prevents this collection from being classified as a unified, coherent structural body. They are necessary but disparate historical record of 2 centuries of problem-solving.
We both agree, however, that the complexity of this material, the sheer 2 centuries of necessary change represented in these 27 amendments, requires us to look at the middle and later amendments not as a single group, but through the dual lenses of both structural progress and specific historical reaction.
Absolutely, and there is certainly more to explore in how each of these specific amendments necessitated intricate updates to various articles of the original Constitution itself, redefining what the structure of the Republic even means over time.